I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the Science Gateways Community Institute. We essentially are funded by the National Science Foundation to help build a community around the Science Gateways area. So that is essentially facilitating events like this, but also providing expertise and um, uh, other kinds of resources to the members in the community. And we do that through 5 service areas, which some of which overlap and collaborate on some of the services that are available to you. So I'm just going to go through those briefly. So the incubator area is essentially to provide short-term consulting through different kinds of on different topics that might be useful for a gateway. For example, our guests presenting today are experts in cybersecurity, and we've partnered with the CTSC to have them provide cybersecurity evaluations as part of that. But we also have specialists in um, sustainability, usability, graphic design, and project management and so forth, as well as technology advice. So that's available to anyone who needs a bit of advice and doesn't have the wherewithal or finances to hire their own. Those same experts are also made available through our 1 week long boot camp, which is offered for free. The only cost to participants is to pay for your travel and hotel and a couple of dinners, but otherwise everything is included. And you might have noticed that on the previous slide, our next one is coming May 14th. So in late March is the deadline for applying for that. So I just want to point that out to you. Extended developer support is our area that provides hands-on programming and development for gateway projects. It can be either to get a gateway started or it can be to add a feature. And that provides someone up to a quarter time for anywhere from 3 to 12 months. The Scientific Software Collaborative has been developing a gateways catalog, which is going to currently lists gateways. So if you are not in there, you should go in to our website and add yourself. It's a way for both users and builders to discover other gateways, whether it's to see how someone has accomplished a particular task, or in the case of users, to find something that they can use for their research or in the classroom. And what's also being added right now is the ability to provide components that could be reused in gateways, and so it's another discovery mechanism for that. Community engagement and exchange is the area of the Institute that brings you this webinar. We also have a conference which will be in Austin, Texas this upcoming September, and the call for participation for that will be released at the end of this month with a deadline of early May, I think it is, or June. Now I'm forgot. Anyway, you'll find that on our website. And finally, workforce development provides internships and courses, workshops, and so forth that are designed to help people in the earlier stages of their career or still in college or graduate programs to learn more about becoming gateway developers. So my last little comment here is that I will be posting on our chat area a link to our feedback form. Because NSF funds us to do this, they like to know how we're doing, and while we can show them headcounts, we can't indicate whether people actually liked our webinar unless you tell us if you did. So if you can take a moment at the end before you get on to whatever your next task of the day is, this feedback form is literally a couple of multiple choice questions plus an optional open answered question. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to our presenters. I'm delighted today to have Mark Krenz and Von Welch from Indiana University talking about cybersecurity. And as I mentioned, they are our partners in providing cybersecurity advice for the Science Gateways Community Institute. And just so you know, they also provide cybersecurity evaluations just more generally, and they have a call for engagement applications that are due April 6th. So with that, you're going to want to share your screen, guys, and take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. This is Vaughn Welch. Can
Okay. So I need to share my screen now.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Great.
Excellent. We can see it.
All right. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Nighty, for having us here today. For those in the audience, how do I sound? Can someone give me a little feedback in the chat room? Make sure that I'm coming through loud and clear.
You're definitely coming through loud and clear. Just so you
Okay.
know. Yeah.
Good. I'll go ahead and progress here. So first of all, thank you for joining us and thanks for this opportunity. What Mark and I are going to talk about is cybersecurity for the modern science gateway. We're going to do this here in a pretty brief half hour, 35 minutes sort of a thing. So this will be a little bit more of a collection of resources and some higher level principles rather than lots of detailed how-to. So we're going to tell you sort of, where to go fish and a little bit about how to fish and not all the every detail and bringing you fish on that sort of front. We're going to talk about cybersecurity here broken down into three key aspects. So first, just around the software development and engineering process. Science gateways are essentially, they're software entities. They're developed using software development programs. And so we're going to talk about some of the issues that just go around the doing software development engineering in such a way so that you can create and maintain a secure piece of cyber infrastructure, namely the gateway at the end. The second area is getting a little bit more towards the security end of things. We're going to talk about identity and access control management. And we break that out because most of you in the community are really, you're not just standing up this nice looking science gateway, you're really looking to serve a community of researchers out there. And when you talk about serving communities of researchers, you want to be able to identify them, authenticate them, know who they are, know how to be able to report how many they are, and have those sorts of issues. And this is where identity and access control management comes into play, is letting you manage that community that you have. Then we're going to talk fully towards the cybersecurity, talk about the operational cybersecurity, the things that you're going to do largely sort of behind the scenes to make sure that your science gateway stays secure and reliable and maintains the expectations of your user community and good relations with your resource provider. And so speaking of which, we're going to talk about sort of the question of, let me just talk why, do you care about cybersecurity? I think some of this is kind of evident, but there's some subtleties here that I want to break down because science gateways are in an interesting place in sort of the cyber infrastructure ecosystem. You can sort of think of yourself as being this bridge between a science community and these computational resources, with goals to make those accessible and easy to use and high number of details. These are goals that many of you have. And so you've got some complex relationships there. On one side, you're working with resource providers. You're running software on them. You're providing access to those resource providers in ways that 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, were not common. Back in the days of SSH, before science gateways were so popular, those resource providers interacted directly with their users. And now, in some sense, you're sitting between them. So you've got the resource providers on one side, and then you've got the community on the other. And so you have these two trust relationships that you build and maintain between these two communities that are a necessity for your success and the success of your community and the success of the resource providers providing the resources. And then what we think about are the sort of traditional, more cybersecurity aspects. You're going to have assets that you're going to pull up. If not, you'll have information about your users. You'll have the data that the users provide you. These things may not, some of these things, your user data may be really open. You know, a lot of scientific communities aren't concerned about confidentiality of their data, but on the other hand, they may be very concerned about the integrity of their data. And so we'll talk a little bit about the confidentiality and integrity of doing these key assets. So I think with that now, I'm going to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Mark Krenz, who's going to walk through some of these things in more detail.
Thanks, Vaughn. So as we go over these resources I'm going to cover, at the bottom of most of the slides, you'll find a URL at the bottom, and you can take a note of that so you can look into more detail about each of the resources. This will also be posted on YouTube. I think SGCI records the presentation, so you can go back and look if you miss a URL. I think Vaughn will also be posting some of the URLs in the chat. So I think it's important, you know, science gateways don't just stand in isolation. They're a infrastructure that's built up to support a piece of software that acts as the gateway itself. And so when you put a science gateway online, you're not just thinking about the security of the science gateway, you also have to think about the security of having an online service in general, plus the specific concerns that you have for science gateways, such as connecting to like an XSeed service. So the first resource I wanted to talk about is the CIS Top 20. This is a list of 20 best practices in cybersecurity. The URL is there at the top. These are controls that you can implement that are recommended to eliminate the majority of an organization's vulnerabilities. The top 5 alone are considered to eliminate like 80 or 90% of the vulnerabilities out there in an organization. I'm going to only go over the top 5 due to time constraints. So the first one is make sure you understand what's going on your network as far as what's authorized and unauthorized devices and hosts and servers that you have set up. In today's Internet of Things age and virtual machines age, you could have a wide variety of devices that people bring in as staff members and want to hook them up to the network. We're out of the age of just people bringing in laptops and desktop computers of their own and into people hooking up their phones and their internet-connected picture frames and space heaters and maybe even their car to your network. What you want to start out with is determine what your business need is for specific pieces of hardware. You know, can you get by with just laptops and desktops? Do you need tablets? Do you need phones? Try to be conservative in the approach so that you don't allow things on by default as new technologies become available. And then write a policy based on that. Make sure you communicate that policy with your users so that they're not surprised when you reject their internet connected space heater, you know, on just fire safety concerns, but also on network safety concerns. In terms of server infrastructure, you also want to keep track of what servers you've set up for, you know, testing software for development. You may find that you've set up several virtual machines or servers that you've forgotten about, and those machines later become compromised. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of all the servers and the hosts that you're setting up. One way you can check for violations is by looking at things like DHCP logs, doing network scans, or just doing a review periodically of the hosts that you have set up in your documentation and eliminating ones that are no longer in use or adding ones that have been added. This is kind of a funny cartoon that, you know, indicates the problem that we have with just random hosts being put onto the network these days. This is the joy of tech. It's mostly speaking to you know, the Internet of Things devices that you'd have in a home and how they could hold your house for ransomware. But the idea is still kind of the same. You can end up with a lot of devices that have questionable levels of security, and they're behind the firewall inside of a trusted zone. and those devices may not have security updates for them anymore. The company that supports them may go out of business and so on. So this indicates the threat. The next control is having to do with an inventory of the software that you have. Again, determine the need that you have in your organization to do different tasks, whether it's a desktop or a server. Determine what, do we need Microsoft Office? Do we need video conferencing software on a server? What kind of services do you need to run? Can you turn off mail? Can you turn off, you probably need a database and a web server. Do you need SSH turned on or not? Things like that. Back in the 90s, it used to be that a Linux system would come with an option for installing everything and turning on almost every service, even without the firewall being turned on by default. So you can imagine that those systems going onto the internet were frequently attacked because they were running several services that people weren't even watching. So turn off what you can, and then again, write a policy on this and enforce it, and try to be conservative in what you allow. And when you're testing new software, it helps to have some kind of isolated system for evaluating the software so that you're not installing all the test software onto your workstations or servers that are used in production, and forgetting that you've installed some software for testing. And then, as I said, remove unneeded software from systems that don't need it. And then the next control, the third control, is use secure configurations for your hardware and software. For operating systems, you can do a quick search on the net for security hardening guides or how to secure such and such piece of software. And for most common software, you'll find a guide that will help you set the configuration of Apache or Linux or Windows so that it has kind of a base secure configuration that's going to stop a lot of attacks from becoming successful. And do the same thing for the hardware that you use too, because firmware on computers can be vulnerable to attacks, and you need to make sure that you keep your BIOS firmware up to date. Just in the past year, there was a vulnerability in Intel AMT remote management systems that basically allowed people to bypass a host firewall, that's the firewall on the OS, and view the console of the system directly without the OS interfering at all. So you need to make sure that you keep firmware updated to prevent problems like this, especially when as new vulnerabilities get released. And if you can, isolate the functionality of your system into different parts. So instead of having one monolithic server with all your services that you need, such as web servers, database servers, mail, SSH jump hosts, or whatever, and your custom gateway code, try to separate them out so you have a system for the web server, a system for the database, a system for the jump host, so that if one gets compromised, it doesn't mean it compromises the whole system. It also adds to the resiliency if you have a hardware problem of some kind or a software problem and something crashes. The fourth control is talking about, is one you'll probably be familiar with from updating your host frequently. Make sure you're keeping your software updated and patched with the latest patches that come out to fix various vulnerabilities. Subscribe to notifications for software that you use. So if you're using Nginx, look to see if they have like an Nginx notification list that you can subscribe to. That way, as a vulnerability patch comes out, you'll be in the loop immediately that you should be updating your software and any kind of configuration that you might need to change. Because sometimes it's not just a patch, it's also a configuration change that they can't just send out a patch for. There's general security notification lists that you can subscribe to, such as Bug Track. Bug track is kind of high volume, getting several posts a day. You can subscribe in a digest form, so that which is what I do, where you just get a single email at the end of the day that has a summary of all the posts that were made. And CTSC, we also have a cyber infrastructure vulnerability list that is more targeted at scientific projects and the type of software that's run in scientific projects. We have our own group internally that meets weekly to discuss new vulnerabilities that we should send out notifications about. So that's a good one to subscribe to that's science focused. And then make sure you're reviewing your system logs for attacks. This is a frequently overlooked one. People set up services and they think, I'm logging information to system logs, but then they don't have a time of the week or a time of the day that they dedicate to reviewing the system logs to see what's happened on their network and happened to various services. And then check your network for vulnerable software. There's automated tools like OpenVAST that can do this for you and send you a report. And there's other methods of checking for vulnerabilities. This cloud service, SSL Labs, is a service that will let you check your web server to make sure it's up to date with the latest best practices for SSL use. It's a nice tool that you can use. You just go there and you put in your website address, and it does the scan for you and gives you a report and a grade rating. The one thing to keep in mind is that by default, it'll add your website address and the results of the scan to their front page and to like this public list of results. There's a box you can check underneath the form that will say, please exclude my website from the public report, because you don't want to put in your website address and then find out that you get an F in security and then have that publicly posted to the site, because there's people actually watching that site for vulnerable hosts, and they'll make you a target. And then the fifth one that I want to cover is basically don't be root or the super user in everything that you do. When you are the root user or the super user in OS, a lot more serious exploits are possible. The vulnerabilities, they look for privilege escalation, which is where they come in as a vulnerability under a normal user, and then they gain, through a privilege escalation vulnerability, they get access to the root account. If you're the root account, then they don't have to have that privilege escalation vulnerability. They can just do what they want to as the root account. And this includes things like installing keyloggers that will log all the typing you do on your system, setting up services that run on the network, turning off firewalls, even installing rootkits into your firmware so that even after you reinstall your OS, your host is still compromised at the hardware level. Don't be administrator all the time. Only be administrator for the actions that you need to, like when you're installing a new piece of software. And if you have any question about that, you can pretty much ask, search online for, do I need to be the administrator to do this action? And probably somebody's asked that question before, and you can kind of get a third-party answer to verify that it's okay. On Linux, you should use sudo. Your system administrators and developers and anybody who needs access to super user privileges should use sudo. And try to limit how much sudo access you give. It's possible to configure sudo so that instead of just giving full-fledged access to root, that you only give it access to do specific things like restart the database server or make a backup or deploy a new version of code. So you can configure sudo to allow your developers to only do a couple of actions and your system administrators to do the majority of the other administrative actions. Maybe you have another staff member that needs to do something as root, and you can narrow it down just to one specific action. And then for actual setup of the administrative account, you want to use a strong password or disable the login altogether. and you know, like a 16-character randomly generated password is recommended. And make sure it's different from other passwords. It doesn't help if you have a strong password if it's the same as your normal user account that you just had compromised by logging into a phishing site. So you want to make sure that your passwords are always different for different purposes and different users. And try and limit who actually has access to that administrative account to just like just your system administrators or one or two people, so that's limited. And in Science Gateways, you have often have a service that you've written code for that is running as a service, and you want to try to have a dedicated user for that, those kind of network services that are listening. Don't run them as the root user. If you run them as a root user, then if that service gets compromised, it means a compromise of the root account, and then all those vulnerabilities and things that can be done as root can happen through your service. And set up two-factor authentication if you can for admin access. That's always a good recommendation. So getting now into secure software development and engineering, the NSF themselves on their website have stated that science software must be reliable, robust, and secure, able to produce trustable and reproducible scientific results. In terms of cybersecurity, we talk a lot about a CIA triad, and I'm not referring to the government agency there. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And this statement from the NSF speaks a lot to the integrity aspect of that triad. So, you know, in science data, usually you don't care too much about the confidentiality, although that is a concern when you're talking about PII data or not releasing scientific data before you're ready to release it. But usually the goal is to eventually release the scientific results. So confidentiality isn't as big of a concern. But integrity is a very high concern because you don't want to be releasing scientific results that are inaccurate. These are some aspects of a good software engineering practice so that you're not just doing ad hoc, paste and pray type of programming and writing stuff that goes directly into your production environment. You want to have a process that involves these things. I'll go over each one. And you'll see these, there's a set of slides down near the bottom, Secure Software Engineering Best Practices by two of our colleagues, Randy Hyland and Susan Sons, in which they talk about these aspects in more detail. So the first one is have a version control system. Git and Mercurial are two recommended ones that are very popular to use. They'll keep track of your code, checksum it, make it possible to easily roll back changes and help you find out when a vulnerability in your code was added and by who and how, and try to prevent you from making that mistake again. If you're using a hosting provider for one of these version control systems, you want to make sure that it actually provides you with the permissions you need for making changes to branches and rolling back changes. Some of the hosting providers out there don't actually give you access to a sophisticated permission system. Gitolite is one that you can host in-house and will give you a lot of the permissions that you need. Whereas GitHub, apparently, while a lot of people use it, it actually doesn't, when you roll back some branch changes, it actually deletes some metadata and you lose some of the historical data that you want, and you can't restrict who can delete branches as easily. And also when you're using, one thing to keep in mind when you're using a version control system is if you have a sensitive data leak, like let's say a database password ends up in a code file, the proper recovery from such an event is not just to remove that line of code and recommit the code to the repository. You want to also follow up and make sure you change the password for the service that it belonged to. This has gotten a lot of people in the past I've seen happen. So testing. So one way you can check for previously known vulnerabilities or future vulnerabilities is to add functional and unit tests to your code process so that before you roll things out in production, you do these tests. Go through a list of common vulnerabilities and create tests for them so that the testing process can catch a vulnerability before you deploy it to production. Another way you can test is to test the process of your software engineering model to see, how the procedure works in real situations. Let's say one of your developers actually is away on business and not available when a critical vulnerability is discovered. Well, you can have a tabletop exercise and try to go through the process and see how would we actually deal with that situation. So this is another way that you can test. Static code analysis. These are tools that will check your written code for software weaknesses. They aren't necessarily vulnerabilities, but they're bad practices in code that you want to look out for, and these tools will help you find those. There's a wide variety of tools available, and they vary by languages. And there's some cloud services out there that can help you do this automatically, so you don't have to set up like a large tool environment. One of those is the Swamp. Full disclaimer, Vaughn and I both are connected with the Swamp, but it's a free service. And they offer not only an online web service for checking your code, but they also offer a Swamp in the Box service where you can download and run your own personal Swamp inside your network. This makes it so that if you're not comfortable with submitting your code to a cloud service, you can actually run it on a trusted host that you have. And then when you do have a vulnerability, what is your process for handling that? You want to make sure that you have a way for people to notify you about vulnerabilities that they discover, such as having a secure, having an email address like security@yourdomain.org that people can email to a trusted contact that will take in information about the vulnerability that's discovered and pass it along to just a limited number of people. And then, you want to make sure you're fixing and patching and testing the vulnerability, and then communicating the fix back to the stakeholders and the users that are using it. Especially, this is a concern if you're deploying software that is open source in the community, so you're distributing it to a wider audience. And then during release and delivery, you want to make sure that you want to have a code signing process in place, so you're cryptographically signing your code so people can verify that that the code that they downloaded from a source really belonged to the author of the code. This is when you see things like SHA-1 hashes and MD5 hashes and code signatures on code. This is part of that release and delivery process of validating the code that it came from the proper author and isn't, being injected in the middle with some malware. There's lots of secure coding processes out there. You want to make sure that you go with one that at least has requirements and a testing section. I mean, these other sections will be part of almost all the processes as well, but you'll find some are 4-stage, some are 7-stage. But the requirements and testing are a critical part of any secure coding process. This down at the bottom is a great presentation by Bart Miller and Alyssa Hyman about secure coding. They go over the aspects of several different languages, starting out with C, but going into some higher level languages and concerns that you need to worry about. And then getting into the identity management. So identity and access management and federated identity systems, they're abbreviated IAM and sometimes IDM. These are basically systems where you outsource your identity management to a third party that handles it for you. You may be familiar with this process if you've ever logged into a website using Facebook or Twitter or Google or maybe your local academic institution has some way of logging into multiple services. This is federated identity management. And it's something good for security because it removes the responsibility, well, it removes the brunt of the responsibility of maintaining those access lists and access controls on the back end. You know, in the past, people would often keep their own database in Etsy password or LDAP or NIS, and then they would have to be responsible for maintaining the security of those things and keeping them up to date, making sure that people use strong passwords and so on. With federated identity management, you can pass that responsibility to one of these systems. There's some good resources here at the bottom. So basically, don't reinvent the wheel. CI Logon, Globus, and Common, these are all federated identity systems that you can look into and choose one that fits your needs. And then on top of, you know, normal cybersecurity, it's more than just thinking about vulnerabilities and hacks. There's a whole process to it. You know, how are we having secure communications with our colleagues, with people that we work with, and then pen testing. You know, there's lots of different aspects to cybersecurity. Here's some more resources. The one at the top that I mentioned before, Science Gateway Security Recommendations. This was specifically targeted at Science Gateways and was written by Jim Bassey and Von Welch. Some other resources. With that, I wanted to remind everybody that there are CTSC and SGCI are here to help. We have email lists, webinars, training engagements, events that you can go to. Bon already mentioned the call for engagements. Go to trustedci.org to find out more about CTSC or sciencegateways.org for SGCI. And with that, I'll go back a slide. So if you wanted to write down any of these resources, you can. And I'll open up the floor to questions.
Here was one question about GitLab versus GitHub and whether you're recommending one over the other.
The thing that, okay, so my general instinct is to try to avoid putting your source code. I mean, it really depends on whether you're talking about using a source code repository for publishing your gateway source code because it's open source, or you just want to use GitHub or GitLab as your repo. I don't have a recommendation for one over the other. I'm not as familiar with GitLab. Gitolite is one that Susan Sons actually recommends, which is one that you would host in-house. But you want to make sure that, you know, if you're using GitHub or GitLab as your main code repository, that you kind of have to have a process for getting the code there to make sure that you're not leaking sensitive data as you do so.
Thanks, Mark. There's also a question that just popped up. What are your recommendations for protecting Jupyter Hub servers? We would like to reduce barriers for usage and hence have explored an open platform, but that leaves us exposed to bit mining operations.
Well, there is a big concern with Jupyter Hub in that it allows you to run arbitrary code in the notebooks. I'm still actually getting on board with the whole Jupyter Hub software and looking into its security and seeing what reviews have been done of it. I found an article when just searching for Jupyter Hub about the security problems with it, the vulnerabilities, and there was an article from I think a year ago where somebody discussed these exact problems of it being able to run arbitrary code. They were able to get a Python shell just by going to a Jupyter notebook instance. But it's not necessarily my area of expertise, so I'll have to get back with you on that.
Great. You know, one thing I was wondering if you could also go back to, and maybe because it does seem like the kind of thing that would be perfect for incubator consultation, is you were talking about the federated login services. There were 4 of them, and
Mhm.
and I was wondering, maybe since we have plenty of time, if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of things people should be thinking about as they're choosing between these different services.
Yeah. Hi, Catherine. This is Vaughn. I'll step back in here because I've done a fair amount of this. So the backing up sort of one stage before I talk about the specific services in general, reasons why people may want to look into this is probably everyone here has had the experience of setting up a gateway at one point or another. And you start registering users and you start having to create a password for each user and then deal with the issues of what happens when the user loses or forgets their password and creating a new password. And the hassles there with, well, are they really the same user who created the account in the first place, and all of those things. So the first order, what these services do is enable you to use federated identities, that is the identities of the home institution, to log into your gateway, so that then you are just to the point where you know who the user is and you control what they can do on your site, but the process of authenticating them is outsourced back to their home institution. Some of you may have done this with sort of a single sign-on on websites before, things like CAS, or if you've ever done something like, log in here with your Google account or log in here with your Facebook account. It's these sort of functionality on this. I'll talk briefly about this list. I'm actually going to go from, I'm going to start actually with InCommon and then jump around a little bit. So InCommon, the third item down, is a collection of standards and protocols across higher education institutions in the US that allow for a large number of colleges and universities to leverage the user's local authentication there. Now, InCommon is most easily consumed by you as a gateway through probably one of the first 2 services up there, CI Logon and Globus Authentication. CI Logon you can sort of think of as a Swiss Army knife. It takes InCommon, it also takes Google accounts and other ways of authenticating and presents it to you all through sort of a common interface. And if you're a gateway that, for example, needs to use X509 certificates, CI Logon can also provide those X509 certificates for you. And CI Logon is run by one of our colleagues, Jim Basney, over at NCSA and University of Illinois. Globus Auth, some of you may be familiar with. This is part of the Globus suite of online data management services, and they provide Globus Auth as a way of managing not only authentications, but some group management and other aspects. And it actually is built on top of CI Logon and InCommon there. OrcID, which is the one at the very bottom, is a little bit different. Some of you may be familiar with OrcID as an identifier for researchers. Researchers were running into the problem. They would move between institutions, or they would change their name, for example, after getting married or for other life events, or they would run into collision problems. The number of Professor Jane Smiths or John Smiths out there. And so OrcID started getting into the habit of providing persistent identifiers for people. And then they started allowing the use of those identifiers to log into websites. And so OrcID is a place that you can send. So if somebody doesn't fit well into InCommon, for example, their home institution doesn't provide it, OrcID allows for a good, what we call a catch-all. And so these services put together provide you a suite, and you could probably leverage one of the top 2, CI Logon or Globus Auth, most directly and simply as a way of authenticating what may turn out to be all of or a large percentage of your user base.
Fantastic, thank you. A couple questions came in while you were telling us about that, and I think 2 of them are related to this list. One person said, what about CO Manage? And another asked about EduRoam.
So CO Manage and co-manage is how we usually say it, and then
Okay.
EduRoam. Let me start with EduRoam. EduRoam is basically Wi-Fi authentication at higher education institutions. And it's very, very specialized for Wi-Fi authentication. If you open your laptop, it's what allows you to leverage it. Just on the off chance that the person was asking about EduGain instead, let me briefly mention EduGain. EduGain is an international federation. So InCommon works here in the US. Many of the other countries in Europe and Asia, South America, and even Africa now are setting up their own identity federations. And EduGain, which is InCommon of, is the fabric that actually is starting to span that global community of identity providers. For most of the time, it's going to be behind the scenes from your perspective, but just realize that's what's out there and is allowing that interconnectivity. Back to co-manage. Co-manage is a product that came out of, I believe, originally Internet 2 and is now getting a fair amount of work from Spherical Cow Group and others. And it's a group management service. So a little bit similar to what's built into Globus Auth. You know, a typical thing you'll have is you don't just sort of have users that you work with in isolation. They tend to be research groups, and the research groups tend to want to share amongst themselves. And you need a way to sort of manage, well, who's in which research group, and sometimes you'll have users that are in multiple research group, and research groups may have hierarchical relationships. And simply put, co-manage is the tool for managing those relationships.
Great, thanks. Another question came in and said, when downloading software or posting a software for download, if the software and the checksum values are both on the same website, that doesn't seem very good, because if a hacker can change the software on the site, then it can change this checksum value posted. Is there a way to make this safer? That was Mona.
Yeah. Those of you without video missed Mark and I pointing at each other. This is a tough problem to be very sure on this, because yes, this question is absolutely right. If you just have a hash or a checksum of the software and you post it right alongside, really what that's protecting you against is accidental corruption of that tarball, disk or network or other weird things like that. It's not really protecting you against a malicious entity that will modify, would probably be smart enough to modify both. Really, to protect against the malicious entity, you really want a digital signature of some sort, which means that you have to share a public key for that signature out of band. Some of you who have maybe downloaded software like GPG or have used some of these repositories like RPM, there are keys for the repositories that get distributed out of band that you have to check. So yeah, a checksum isn't really strong enough to prevent a malicious thing. You really need a digital signature. Mark, anything?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, one thing you can do, and the person who asked this is right on. This is a problem that's hard to solve. One thing you could do is look at other sources for the software, like if it's something that's mirrored, you could see if the checksum has changed at other places. You could even go back to a site like archive.org and maybe find an older version of the page to see if the checksum has changed in some way. But yeah, it's just kind of a validator. And digital signatures, but you have to have the certificate from the author of the code in advance for this to work.
Says thanks, so I guess you answered a question. So far there aren't other questions coming in. I'll give people a moment or two to think if they have any other questions. In the meantime, I think what I'll do real briefly is share my screen and find out what the next event is happening. Just one moment here. I'll be there in a second. And then we'll let people keep on thinking about what they might want to ask about.
I will say I'm happy that the person asked the question about Jupyter Hub, because one of the consultations that we're doing with SGCI, that organization also brought up Jupyter Hub, and it seems like I'm going to have to do a bit of a review of that and check kind of a security assessment of it. So in the future, I may be releasing a bit of a report on Jupyter Hub specifically after I've actually gone through the process of setting one up and looking to see how it works.
Great, thanks. And I just noticed that Vaughn posted the CTSC's engagement application link. So that's taking applications through April 6th. And their resources, I'll mention, are also available through Science Gateways Community Institute. So I just want to remind you that this is also a benefit of coming to the boot camp, which I mentioned at the beginning. So if you joined late, do consider whether, if you have a gateway, you'd like to learn a whole bunch of different types of topics, which will include cybersecurity. And so the other thing I wanted to mention is that our upcoming webinar in March, on March 14th, is on sustainability for gateways, and it will be presented by Nancy Maron, who's also part of our bootcamp instruction team, and she consults with many organizations about different kinds of digital creations and how to make them sustainable. So that should be a nice introduction and taste of what you can expect to think about as you consider your own sustainability. And I'll put in another pitch. Please do give us feedback about this in our evaluation, which takes very little time, and the link is also in the chat area. So while I've been blabbing away, I see that another question came in, which is great. So Mark asks, concerning validating the software hashes by a digital signature, is there a way in which we can encourage the I think this is IAM folks to add the capability of adding a public key to our identity?
Uh, uh,
And it says, oh, assuming we are the software
Software
provider.
provider. Yeah. So as I understand Mark's question, he's, if he's providing software, and I mentioned the digital signatures a couple of minutes ago, he's asking about the capability of getting the IAM providers to add a public key to the identity. So I think I'll break the news. Short answer is probably no. And the reason why I say that is the overall community has gone through kind of a long phase of doing public key based identities, and these were called PKIs or public key infrastructures. And those infrastructures, there's a long history here, have more or less probably at this point been are in process of being supplanted by more web-friendly technologies such as SAML and OAuth. And I don't think we're going to work a public key back into the full IAM system. I think the way for a software provider to go about doing this is to pick up some of the standard utilities that are out there, like OpenPGP or OpenGPG, and do a project key for the project. And there's reasons why you probably want to consider a project key anyway, so you can have multiple releasers, or if somebody leaves the project. So having less of a person-specific identity and more project-specific identity has certain arguments to be made for it. So this is getting into a little bit of a complicated subject there, but that's my my quick answer to this, Mark.
Thanks. That is currently our last question. I don't know if any more will come in, but we'll hold our breath and wait and see. I'll mention also, because I have your ear at the moment, that we have a couple of summer opportunities, both for projects such as gateways, as well as for students. And those are that we have internships where, if you'd like to have an intern working on your site, they will be mentored by one of our team members to work on your gateway. They would be sited at one of our locations so that they're nearby to someone who can help them, and they can do 8 weeks worth of work on your project. And those applications are at that URL that's here at the bottom of this slide that you can see. It'll describe more about it, and you can apply for that. And those are due also in the month of March. So I encourage you to do that, as well as if you have students who would like to learn about uh, coding more generally for gateways. There's a 4-week coding institute for undergraduates. So since we only have about 3 more minutes to go and no more questions have come in while I've been putting in that pitch, I want to thank our 2 presenters who did a terrific job, Vaughn and Mark, for helping us learn about cybersecurity. And I do hope you guys will consider taking into consideration applying for their program, because it is really super, and it is and they're really experienced. So I'm seeing lots of thank yous coming in through chat as well, you guys. So just so you know, we have some appreciative audience here. So with
Well,
that,
thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to all the audience for their attention, also their great questions. And I think folks also know, you mentioned your boot camp will be part of the presentations there at that boot camp, and so we'll look forward to further interactions with folks there.